Hello dear chess friends, I'm International Master Andrey Ostrovskiy and you're welcome to the second lesson of the series dedicated to diagonals in chess, in which we are mainly focused on the question how to make diagonal weak for our opponent, how to clear it up, and how to exploit this weakening. And the first example is from the game between Laurentis and Keres. Paul Keres is the famous top grandmaster of the past. And we can see that Black has a great control over the center. Black has very active knight on e4. Black also has a good concentration of the pieces, mainly on the king side. Black already created some pressure there using the pawn f4. So as you can see, it attacks e3 square, which is very important. And also we can notice diagonal a8, h1, which might be very important in the future. But at the moment, it looks more or less protected in white's camp. So the question is how to make it less protected, how to make it weak. Definitely, we can notice that this diagonal is mainly protected by the knight f3. And this knight in its turn is protected by the bishop and by the pawn. So Black has to act somehow to get rid of these defending pieces. And Black's first move is quite logical. Knight goes to g5. First of all, making bishop active. So now there is no limit on the way of this bishop. And at the same time, exerting direct pressure on f3. So now Black has a positional threat of taking on f3 two times, after which White's pawn structure on the king side will be completely damaged. And despite Black will give up his light squared bishop, well, these new weaknesses will be just enough for Black to obtain the advantage. So White has to protect the knight somehow, or just to go away. But the problem with going away with the knight is that, in addition to the threat of taking on f3, Black created another threat. For instance, if knight goes to the normal square on d4, Black has very simple bishop e4 move, and you can see that minimum Black will end up with the extra material after that. So knight e4 doesn't look good. What else? For instance, if knight goes to d2, just to go away and protect e4 squares, you can say bishop e4 makes no sense now. Black has very promising f3 continuation, just forcing weakening of the king side. And as we can see, Black simply has much more resources there, so this attack might be very annoying. Just for example, if pawn takes on f3, then Black can continue with knight h3 check. And then after, let's say, king to h1, which looks more or less sensible, Black just continues exerting pressure with the help of queen to h4, creating a threat of knight takes f2. Also, there are different maneuvers of the rook, including rook f5 to g5. Let's say in the case of king g2, rook goes to f5, and then rook g5 is already a very nasty threat. So this position looks simply awful for White. That's why probably knight can't go away somewhere. Different options for White to protect the knight. Now all of them have some drawbacks. For example, queen d1, which helps White to go away with the queen from this nasty pin on diagonal b1 h7, which means to meet the threat of bishop e4 and to protect the knight f3 at the same time, gives Black a chance to play bishop e4 anyway. And after rook goes to d2, Black manages to take on e3, just at least, okay? Maybe Black has something better, but at least this continuation leads to some sort of advantage, because after f takes on e3, we can see this weakened pawn on e3, which is quite bad for White, because Black will have clearer perspectives against this pawn. E-file is open, so no problems to attack this weakness, while Black has no weaknesses in his camp at all. Right, so this is kind of advantage for Black and quite annoying for White to play this position, but probably it was the best chance, because in the game after knight 4 to g5, White just took on f4, solving both problems. So after that, as you can see, knight f3 is protected by the rook, and bishop e4 is not that great because White simply takes the knight on g5, but this allows Black to take on f4 with the knight, and this simply wins by force. As you can see, the knight is very active. It attacks the rook, the bishop, the g2 pawn. After rook e3, almost the only move here, attacking the queen, black exchanges very important defender of the diagonals. Knight takes on e2 with check, queen takes e2, and now knight takes f3. The pawn structure on the king side inevitably becomes damaged, which means that diagonal a8 h1 becomes completely weak for white, and black will have a chance to exploit it immediately. So g takes f3, queen g5 check, going away from the attack and attacking the king at the same time, forcing the king to the very vulnerable square on h1. And now black comes up with the simple combination. The motive for this combination we already saw in the previous lesson of this series. So rook takes f3 first, clearing out the diagonal completely. Rook takes f3, and now queen goes to g4, and we can see that white simply has no normal defense to meet bishop takes f3 next move with the checkmate, or at least winning a queen. So as you can see, to clear up the diagonal, sometimes you need only to make a series of logical moves like here. So black played knight to g5, exerting pressure on the knight, then eliminated one of the main defenders of the knight f3, and just captured the knight, damaging the pawn structure, after which the diagonal became completely open, completely weak for white, so black had no problems to exploit this weakness. Well, this happens not so frequently, so in the majority of cases, you have to act in a much more aggressive way to open up the diagonal, to make it weak for the opponent and to exploit it. So let's see another example. This position is from the game Alexander against Sabo. We can see that white has an advantage in development, so black's light squared bishop is still in the initial position as well as the rook a8. So this gives white some perspectives on the king side where all the pieces are placed. The only problem for white is that one of the minor pieces, here it is the bishop on b2, is quite passive, being limited with the on e5 pawn. So as you can see, if there is no pawn on e5, white will have additional possibilities to attack on the king side, because the bishop will be very active, exerting pressure on g7 square at least. So in such a situation, there is a motive of making the diagonal longer for this bishop. White plays knight to f6. It is check. What is important is that black is forced to take on f6, because if king goes to the corner, then knight g5 is extremely unpleasant. Just attacking h7 pawn, creating numerous threats, for example, to take on f7 in some variations. But the most dangerous threat here is, of course, to attack h7 with the help of the queen. Let's see the consequences of the g takes f6 here. So pawn takes, bishop goes away, let's say, and then simply queen goes to e4, and checkmate on h7 is inevitable. That's the problem with the king h8. So after knight f6, black is more or less forced to take on f6. And here we can see the result of this operation. So queen goes to g3 first, just to force the king to the corner of the board, to force the king on the same diagonal with white's bishop. And after that, pawn takes on f6. And again, we can see that black is simply forced to take the pawn on f6, which means that diagonal becomes completely opened and weak for black, so that white achieves his main goal, to activate the bishop, to open up the diagonal, and to try to exploit this weakness. So there is a threat of a checkmate on g7. At the same time, there is a threat just to take the bishop e7 with a check from the bishop b2 to the king h8. For instance, if rook goes to g8, pawn takes on e7, check, and it's all over now, because black has no chance to protect the king. Let's say e5, queen e5, f6, queen f6, rook g7, queen g7, checkmate. Game is over. So after e takes f6, it's necessary to take on f6. And this makes the diagonal completely open. However, white has some problems here. So we can see that, yes, the diagonal is open, but at the same time, black created the threat of taking the bishop on b2. So our bishop b2 is the key piece in this position. So exactly with the help of this bishop, white is going to exploit the weakness of this diagonal. So white has to solve the problem of keeping the bishop on the board, so to avoid the exchange of the bishop. At the same time, to continue clearing up the diagonal, because white sacrificed the minor piece, so white has to be quite fast in his attack, in his activities, to compensate this material disadvantage. White decides to put the knight in the center, so knight goes to e5. Very good move. After that, black's position is simply hopeless, because look, bishop remains on the board, bishop b2. At the same time, rook now attacks the bishop f6, so white has additional resource to get rid of the main defender of this diagonal, just to sacrifice the exchange. And the knight on e5 itself is very active, creating threats to f7 square, f7 point. It is a square from which the knight potentially can simply checkmate the king, or at least to make a fork and to win some material. So let's have a look on different variations here. So if rook goes to g8, then it's simple. Knight takes f7 with the checkmate. The king is smothered in the corner. If bishop goes to g7, which looks very logical, just to go away with the bishop, rook takes on f7, attacking the bishop. The point here that rook takes f7 leads to a checkmate in 2 moves. Knight f7 check, king goes to g8, and now queen takes g7 checkmate. That's easy. Which means after rook f7, black has very hard choice. So if bishop goes away, then discovered check should decide. If rook goes to g8, there are plenty of different checkmates now. One of them is knight to g6, pawn takes g6. As you can see, bishop is pinned. So queen goes to h3 and checkmate. So after knight e5, black is simply forced to take on e5, bishop takes e5, bishop takes e5 check, forcing f6, and now again the same motive. So rook takes f6, eliminating the last defender of this diagonal. Rook takes f6 and queen g5, creating a sort of bishop f6, and white wins inevitably. Which means that after bishop d7, white can do almost the same. So just to take on f7, let's say, rook takes f7, rook takes f6, rook takes f6, queen goes to g5. The only defense is e5, but bishop takes e5, and game is over. Rook is pinned, no defense to meet bishop takes f6. White wins. Let's have a look on the next position. This one appeared in the game King Kovacevic. We can see that white has pair of bishops, but the problem in that position is not that open, so it is a golden rule. If you have a pair of bishops, you have to try to open up a position, because exactly in open positions, bishops are powerful. So everything starts with white's typical play dedicated to opening the position. So white plays f5 here. The idea is to exert pressure on black's e6 pawn and to force some weakening of black's position. So if black ignores this threat, white simply takes on e6, creating a weakness on e6, and then white will have great chances to win it in a few moves, because white already has an open e-file. So the rest is simple, just to put the rook on e1, then the bishop on h3, and pawn e6 drops. That's the plan. So black is more or less forced to take on f5. And now knight goes to the center to d4 square, attacking both c6 and f5 pawns. That was a plan. So now queen is forced to d7, the only normal defense, and to prevent both threats. And bishop goes to h3, attacking f5 pawn even more, and forcing g6, again the only sensible defense for black. But this leads to weakening of the diagonal a1, h8. Another method to attack some pieces or maybe pawns and force your opponent making pawn moves that weaken diagonal. That is exactly what happened in this game. So now white has different ideas how to exploit this diagonal. For example, it was possible to take on c6, deflecting the queen. So when queen takes here, queen takes on e7, and we can see that white managed to get rid of black's main defenders of the diagonals. Dark squared bishop is no longer on the board, and now this diagonal looks really abandoned and very easy to occupy. That was one of the possibilities, but white found even more interesting one. So after g6, one of a sudden white sacrificed the bishop on f5. Very interesting combination, by the way, and very rare motive. So bishop takes f5. At the moment, it's not that easy to understand what for. Pawn takes on f5. Well, the result that g file is open, but how white can exploit that? Well, they have one more sacrifice. So rook goes to a7. Again, really surprising sequence of moves. Queen is attacked. If queen goes away, white simply regains the sacrificed material, taking the bishop on e7, having completely winning position because of the pawn structure, and completely weakened diagonal a1, h8. It's necessary to take the rook. Now knight takes on c6. So at the moment, white is down the rook and the minor piece, but it's clear that bishop e7 drops because the queen on a7 is attacked. So queen goes to d7, knight takes e7, eliminating the main defender of dark squares in black's camp, and hence making diagonal a1, h8 completely weak. King goes to g7, only move, and now queen jumps to h5. Very nice move. Now there are so many threats that black simply can't meet all of them. So as you can see, there are weakened squares like f5, g5, h6, f6, and even g7. So all those squares are weakened and black simply has no normal defense. Let's have a look at different ways for black to prevent the worst. For instance, d4 looks very natural just to close the diagonal. In this case, white just checks from g5 and then queen f6 leads to a checkmate. Another possibility for black to play is probably to take the knight. But then queen g5 check, king h8, and bishop takes f6. So black is forced to take on f6, queen f6, and queen b6 with the decisive material advantage. Another possibility is to try to cover g5 square and maybe the most testing one, h6. But then knight takes f5, king goes to g8 to avoid the check with the queen. But knight takes on h6, no problem with that. King goes to h7, and then bishop takes on f6. And that's it. So white's threat is very simple. Knight goes away somewhere, and then checkmate on h8. Again, black has no normal defense here. And finally, if rook goes away from f8 to try to evacuate the king through the center, then queen g5, king f8, bishop takes f6, creating sort of queen g7 or queen g8 checkmate. So rook e7 looks like the only move, but then checkmate anyway. Queen g7, king a8, queen g8. Thanks for your attention. See you in next lessons.